Hello and welcome to another episode of the Student Undergraduate Research Experience. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator of undergraduate research here at the University of Saskatchewan. And today we have Brock Egeto, who's from USask Career Services, and he's going to talk to us about acing the interview, a very timely session today. Thanks, Brock.
Yeah. Just a little bit more about me then. Thanks, Merle. So I'm an experiential learning coordinator at USask Career Services. So it's quite a varied role. I support everybody from students and alumni to employers to our faculty and our experiential learning coordinators on campus. Really, ultimately, it comes down to supporting students and finding work experience. In transitioning from university to excuse me, to jobs, to part-time summer jobs, internships, full-time work once they're done university. This presentation here kind of builds on the previous one about resumes and cover letters. And so now, ideally, hopefully you've submitted a really good, strong application to a potential employer. They liked what they saw in your resume and your cover letter, and now they're bringing you in for an interview. And so I'm going to talk about how to have a successful interview and hopefully really win them over and sell yourself as a great potential employee for that organization. So just kind of briefly to introduce the topic here, I think it's again fairly obvious what the purpose of the interview is, but it's still helpful to just make that explicit. So really, the interview is that employer's opportunity to learn just a little bit of you as a potential employee. So they want to hear you speak more about your skill sets that you've articulated, that you have in your resume and your cover letter. I want to hear a little bit more about your personal qualities, your education, your past experiences, and they want to hear you make a very strong connection between all of those things and this job that you're applying for. And so really that's the purpose of the interview. Sometimes, it's also about, finding if you're the right kind of fit. And so it's very much a conversational kind of process. You're getting to know each other a little bit in a personal way as well, and just they're seeing if you're potentially a good fit. But it's helpful for you to think of it as well as an opportunity for you to assess whether they're a good fit for you. It's a two-way conversation, and it's helpful to think of it in that way, I think. So you're going to encounter all kinds of different interview formats. The standard one that most of you will be familiar with is just that in person with one interviewer or maybe a panel of 2, 3, 4, sometimes more interviewers. So that's kind of your common one. In-person, virtual. You'll see either version of that now. Other types of interview formats, telephone interviews, sometimes they'll be used as kind of a screening interview. So prior to the main interview process, they might be calling a larger number of people, maybe for a 10-minute conversation, just to ask a few initial questions to see if you can basically make the short list to come in for the main interview. It's helpful to think about those kinds of interviews in just the same way, prepare in the same way that you would for any interview. We have Skype there, but right now it's any kind of virtual platform. So it might be MS Teams, it might be WebEx. Zoom is probably the most common platform that's used for virtual interviewing. I'm going to come back after we go through all the main content of the presentation and just speak specifically to virtual interviewing and how that's maybe a little bit different, or certain things that you want to keep in mind when you're doing a virtual interview. Group interviews, a little bit less common. I had one once. It was for a retail position, and they brought in 20 candidates at once, and I think there were 3 interviewers. And basically, they just asked questions to the whole group and gave all of those 20 candidates opportunities to answer those questions. And the group interview was really about finding a balance between contributing and participating in that group interview and not dominating it. So it's very much also about how you interact with the other people in that room. Otherwise, it's kind of very similar to your standard interview. Sometimes some companies, as part of the interview process overall, they might include elements of assessment, like a skills assessment, testing. I know some companies will do tests if you're writing emails, or see how well you use Excel or other kinds of programs. So that might be an element of the hiring process. Case style, a little bit less common in certain professions. They might incorporate cases that you have to address and speak to. Presentations, that's something you see a little bit on campus. In other organizations, they do that as well. Typically, well, always, I think you'll be given your topic that you have to then prepare, like a PowerPoint presentation. Maybe you'll come in for the interview, you'll go through all that standard interview questions first, and then maybe at that point you'll be given your opportunity to present to the interviewers. Usually though, you have that time to prepare that in advance, and it's usually because there is an element of that job that would probably be requiring you to present to different groups. So it's really a test of your presentation skills. Reception dining, a little bit less common these days. Certainly right now during the pandemic, I don't think you see that very much. Common to more professional industries, you might see that in law or accounting, where there are elements of the recruitment process where they're bringing people together for receptions or dining experiences. Role play, that was one that I had once when I applied for a position at an art gallery as a docent. And basically, I took the interviewers through the exhibition, and they were just acting as regular visitors to the gallery and asked me questions just to see how I would respond in that kind of a situation. So certain kinds of jobs you might see a role play. And then lastly, there's second and subsequent interviews. So some companies, I'm hearing more these days that the hiring process, and specifically the interview part of it, can happen over a number of different stages. So you might start with the telephone, first interview, second interview, and maybe even a final interview before you find out whether or not you've been hired for that position. It happens a little bit more as you progress further into your career and start looking at higher level positions, but that is part of the interview process in some cases. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a few things that you can do before going into the interview to help you better prepare yourself. Very important things that you do for any interview that you're going in for. The first one there is research the firm, the organization, the industry. So you'll be familiar if you attended my previous presentation on resumes and cover letters. It's as important for the interview, or more important even, than it is when you're preparing your resume and your cover letter. You can really impress them by showing just how much you know about their organization and what they do. So again, check out their company website, check out their about page, check out their Wikipedia. Maybe there's been some articles. As you're doing that reading, ask yourself what jumps out to you, what interests you, what excites you. And those are things that you're going to be able to speak to in the interview. Many interviews, there'll be a question somewhat along the lines of, please just tell us what you know about our organization. So if you can give a really thoughtful answer to that kind of question, that will go a long way in impressing them. So this is another important one here, just understanding that position and the role. So I had mentioned this in the last presentation as well, but it's really important that when you're applying for every job that you save that job posting. Because if you do get called in for that interview, you're going to want to go back to that job posting and review it, I would say, a few times, and really get to the point where you feel very comfortable that you know that position, you know what they're looking for as far as experience, qualities, skill sets. That will also give you a clue as to the kinds of questions that they might be asking you. So any of the skills that they've identified as being important in that job posting or that job description, there may be questions built around getting you to speak more in depth about those specific skills. So really you want to go back to that job posting and really have a very good understanding of it, highlighting again those keywords related to skills and qualities and that sort of thing. Knowing yourself as well. At the very least, I recommend just going back and rereading your cover letter and your resume that you submitted. Some of the questions will often be built on what you've told them in your cover letter and your resume. So they'll ask you to tell them a little bit more about this particular position or this volunteer opportunity or the program of study that you did. So just remind yourself of what you did tell them in the resume and the cover letter. Go back though and think as well about remind yourself of your past experiences, work experience, volunteering, curricular. Think about the examples that you can pull from those different experiences, examples that, again, articulate skills, personal qualities, that sort of thing that they're going to care about. So just, yeah, go back and really familiarize or refamiliarize yourself with your own resume. And then I've already kind of mentioned this a number of times, but just because it's so, so important, because the hiring process is built so much around skills, really do have a very good idea of what your skill set is. It can be helpful to think, what are maybe my top 3 skill sets, and really be able to articulate in very good detail how you have those particular skills. Again, tying them to some kind of evidence from wherever you can to really articulate those skill sets. You'll want to probably have a larger list of skills, but at least be able to speak in very good depth about, I would say, about 3 different skill sets. Be prepared for that. Okay, so moving on. I think all I really want to highlight here is just, again, a reminder that, as you're trying to market yourself and sell yourself to this potential employer, pull as broadly as you need to, or as you can, from your various experiences. So, achievements, projects that you worked on in university, can provide good evidence that you can use in formulating your question responses. Again, volunteering, lots of great stuff that you can pull from that. Extracurricular, if you're involved in teams, again, that's a good example of leadership and teamwork, and that can be an opportunity for you to speak to those skills by referencing, the sports that you played, that sort of thing. So again, just think very broadly when you're trying to find that evidence. Okay, so professional etiquettes. This mostly refers to in person. But it's important as well, to keep in mind for virtual interviewing some of these things, so that dressing appropriately, whether it's in person or virtual. The general rule would be to dress one better than what you would think is the kind of like standard dress of that work environment. So if you think it's probably business casual, maybe you throw on a blazer or something like that, just to dress it up one notch. And that's kind of the standard for how you'd want to dress for interviews, whether it's in person or virtual. If it's in person, it's really important to walk into the interview, shake everybody's hand, introduce yourself, thank them for bringing you in. Just a nice little initial introduction there. Keep in mind there is such a thing as like a professional handshake. So it's just like a nice firm handshake. You don't want to give them the kind of like floppy fish hand, or squeeze their hand too much. So there is such a thing as professional handshake. So it's just something to keep in mind there as well. And just as you're going through the interview, it's helpful to remind yourself just to smile and to maybe slow down and calm yourself, and just try to be positive and warm, because your personality is an important part of how you present yourself in the interview as well. I'll come back to that later, I think. Okay, so let's jump into some of the key interview questions that you're going to need to know and prepare for every interview. So you might not get all of these questions at every interview, but I recommend that you do prepare to answer them for anyone that you go in for. So the first one is, tell me about yourself. So interviews often start off with a version of this question, and I'll come back to a strategy for how to approach that in another slide. Next one there, why did you decide to study your program? So it's amazing how many people actually struggle to articulate why exactly they chose the program that they did. So think about that. I've found that it stumps a lot of people. They get caught off guard. They don't expect to have to talk about their program. What do you know about your organization? So I already talked about that one, but again, always prepare for it. What are your long-term career goals? You might get other versions like that of maybe it's where do you see yourself in 5 years, or where do you see yourself in 10 years, things like that. So the trick with this one, you don't have to say that this is, your dream job or anything like that if it isn't, but they do want to see you make some kind of connection where this job fits into your long-term goals. And basically, you want it to fit into your long-term goals. You need to make that connection there. Um, Basically, it just shows that you have a real genuine interest or need for this position, to want to work there for this organization. They want to see that strong connection there. Why you're interested in this position. So again, thinking back to that job posting, what is it that really interests or excites you about this position? Maybe it's related to your career. Maybe it's an opportunity to do a certain kind of work. Maybe it's the organization that really excites you, or it's an opportunity to build certain kinds of skills or apply certain skills. Maybe it's all of those things. But again, you really want to make a really strong connection there. What are your strengths and weaknesses? I think I'll come back to that one in a couple slides as well. And then a lot of interviews finish with a question along these lines. How are you a good fit for this organization? Or why should we hire you? We often kind of put it bluntly like that in our interviews, right at the very end, say, why should we hire you? And just let them talk. And so this is where it's basically a summary of everything that you've talked about so far. So highlighting the relevant skills and personal qualities that you have, the relevant experience, why you're interested and excited about this position and this organization. So you want to bring it all together, wrap it into a nice little package of why they should hire you over other candidates. So really highly recommend practicing that one beforehand. Don't want to get caught off guard at the end by that one. Okay, so I said I'd come back to this one, the tell me about yourself question that starts off most interviews, or some version of it does. So this is a nice way to approach it. You don't have to follow this exactly, but it does create a nice, well-rounded answer. It gives you a framework for how to introduce yourself at the beginning of the interview. So pause, and you begin with something personal, and it's just really whatever you're comfortable with. I usually say something along the lines of, I was born in Saskatoon, lived in Regina and Vancouver for a few years before coming back to the city. Really like spending time with my family, and being outdoors, and kind of just leave it at that. Again, just whatever you're comfortable with, but just a little personal touch is kind of nice. Then you jump into your academics, so what you studied, why you studied, um, especially focusing in on anything that's particularly relevant, to be able to talk about that there. Work experience, mostly try to keep that to the relevant stuff. Perhaps though, you're maybe making a bit of a career shift, or this is something new for you, so you don't have a lot of relevant work experience, and so you can talk about that past experience, but what you want to try to do is make some kind of connection there, tell that story of that progression from those past experiences into this current one that you're applying for. And then lastly, skills, strengths, or expertise. I would encourage you to think more in terms of strengths or expertise. So again, like, what are one or two things that you are uniquely good at that really define you as a potential employee? So for myself, I would maybe highlight my writing ability or something like that, or writing and relationship building as being two unique qualities that I have, but are also relevant to this position that I'm applying for. So again, this is one that I really recommend that you practice beforehand. A lot of people get really thrown off by this question. They're not comfortable talking about themselves. They feel like they're bragging. So yeah, if it makes you uncomfortable, I would say, maybe write it down beforehand and just kind of work out how you would, ideally work through this kind of a response. Okay, so moving on. There's another one I said to come back to here, strengths and weaknesses. So I already mentioned that it's helpful to think of, 2 or 3 particular strengths that you have and be able to articulate those in some detail. So sometimes you will get a question along the lines of, tell us about what your number 1 strength is, or what are your top 3 skills. And so again, you'll want to be able to articulate those in some detail, breaking down those skills, ideally tying it to some kind of evidence of where you've demonstrated or developed those skills. So this is a really, really important question. It's going to come up throughout the interview, but you might get a very direct question like this. The kind of flip side of the strengths one is the weakness. You won't get this in every interview, but it really throws people off sometimes. So the question that you would get is, tell us what's your number one weakness is, or it might be framed more in terms of what do you think will be the most challenging aspect of this job. So again, it helps to be prepared for that kind of question. And what I would recommend that you do here is you want to give something that is at least in some way relevant, but essentially wouldn't make you a liability. So a good example, one that people commonly use, is public speaking. It's one that I use. Again, it would need to be in some way relevant. So there's got to be some elements of communicating with the public or presenting. So my example would be that I would then say that, I've always really struggled with public speaking. It's not a really comfortable thing for me, but at the same time, it's something that I've been really working on developing. So in doing presentations in my past role, that was something that I commonly had to do, and I really started to get better at it and work at it, and I'm getting more comfortable, and I'm looking forward to the challenge of that in this position and improving on that particular skill. So always bringing it back to some kind of positive like that. How it's not going to be a liability for you. It's maybe an area of challenge, but maybe that's something that excites you. It's not just a challenge, it's an opportunity. So again, just bringing it to some kind of positive in some way. Okay, so now we're going to talk about behavioral-based interview questions. And behavioral-based interview questions typically make up the core of interviews. And so behavioral-based questions, you'll recognize those questions like, tell us about a time when you played a leadership role in an event at work or on a project. Tell us about a time when you experienced conflict in the workplace and how you handled it. Can you give us an example of when you worked as part of a team and what your greatest contribution to that team was? So questions that are framed around some kind of skill area, and that look for you to speak to some kind of past example. So they want you to provide evidence of how you have this skill. So I'm not sure if I have examples here. Well, so these ones here that you see, it's fairly obvious what they're asking about. So that first question there, tell me about a time when you played a leadership role. Obviously they're looking for you to talk about your leadership skill set. So you want to have an example that allows you to elaborate on that skill set. The second one there, tell me about a time when you experienced conflict and how you handled it. Very common interview question. So you want to think, okay, what are the skill areas that they're looking for me to talk about? So with that particular one, conflict, communication, conflict management in and of itself, perhaps teamwork or leadership could be all elements of how you handle conflict. And so you want to bring in those different skill areas as you articulate that response. So here is another framework that will help you approach those behavioral-based questions. This is kind of an ideal way of approaching it. Again, you might not be able to do it with every single response, but the more you can do it, the better. So you get a behavioral-based question. First, you want to describe the situation. So from that example that you're using, you describe the situation. Then you talk about the obstacles or objectives that you had to face in that particular situation. Next, really important here, obviously, the actions that you took to address those obstacles, to deal with that situation. And then the last part there, which a lot of people miss, and it's really important, is just talking about the results and providing some kind of reflection on that. So what happened in the end? Did you resolve that conflict? How was that relationship going forward with that colleague, if that was the source of the conflict? What did you learn from that particular situation? So this is an ideal way of framing it. A lot of people get stumped because they always try to hunt for a really positive example that shows how well they shone in that particular situation. You can effectively use maybe a bit of a negative example. or maybe it didn't go ideally. The important thing there, though, is to talk about what you learned from that situation and how you would do it differently in the future. So, by using that kind of negative example, it gives you an opportunity to show your self awareness. You can still articulate that skill set effectively by showing how you would do it differently or how you have done it differently since then. So, that can give you a really good way of articulating those particular skills as well. Um, so, a lot of people will get these behavioral based questions. Maybe it's one that's framed around teamwork or something like that. They just struggle to find an example. They just can't get there. It's an interview. Your brain's not working 100% all the time because you're nervous. So if you really can't come up with an example, the approach that I would suggest is either asking, if you can come back to that later. So maybe towards the end of the interview, an example pops into your head and you can come back and answer that question. You can maybe ask for a few seconds just to think a little bit longer, or you could answer more in the hypothetical. So you don't have a specific example, but here's how I would handle that kind of a situation, or that kind of, or here's my approach to teamwork, or my approach to leadership, or here's my communication style, and talk a little bit more generally, and it can still give you a very good opportunity to articulate those skill sets. So if you can't think of an example, move into the hypothetical, and that can work as well. Yeah, here's just a few other examples. Describe a time when you had to deal with a difficult person. Again, any kind of job where it's maybe customer service or just dealing with people, you'll probably get a question along those lines. They want to know how you interact with others, how you build relationships. So always be prepared for that kind of thing. It's kind of one of those core skill areas: communication, relationship building, teamwork, things that you'll probably need to talk about in just about any job that you apply for. Tell me about a time when you felt you had to, or when you felt that you dealt with a situation inadequately, and how has that changed how you'd approach the same situation? So that's one where they're prompting you to give a negative example. So sometimes it's helpful to even think of that beforehand as well. What is a negative example that I can use that really, again, sells how I'm self-aware, how I'm capable of adapting and learning? So you might get a question like that. You might get a question about stress. There's that team question there. So lots of examples. At the end, I'll show you where you can find some more on our students.usask website as well. Okay. So moving into tricky interview questions. So there are all kinds of different tricky interview questions that you get. Really, the purpose is to see how you think on your feet. There are things that you can't really prepare for beforehand. They might be really tough questions or silly questions. One that I had one time was, if they were going to make a movie about you and your life, who would play you and how would it end? It was just it totally caught me off guard. I had no idea how to respond to it. And so I took a few seconds and then I kind of just gave a funny, goofy response. And that was all that really mattered. I kind of just rolled with it. So you might get silly questions like that. And that's really the best advice, I think, is just to take it kind of lightly for what it is, and just give yourself a few seconds if you need to, and respond as best as you can. What else do I want to say here? Moving into more of the tough questions, I suppose. So questions that people really, really struggle with, but are quite common down at the bottom there. So what salary are you expecting? That's a tough one to get in an interview. So you always need to be prepared for how you would answer that before you go in for the interview. So you can kind of do a bit of a dodge and say something along the lines of, I'm just really excited about this position and this opportunity. I'm fairly open as far as salary, willing to negotiate or whatever it might be. So you can kind of dodge it along those lines if you want. Sometimes they might press you a little bit. So it does help to come in to the interview prepared to either give your number, if you actually have one, actually give your number, or to give a range. And so maybe you're kind of familiar with what the salary range is for this type of position for somebody just coming into it, and you can give what you know as to be the range, and so you're expecting something within that. That's just fine. If you have your number, give your number. Sometimes you can't or not you're not willing to work for less than $40,000, and so you save them some trouble. You save yourself some trouble by just giving that number in case they come back and they say, "Well, sorry, we can only offer you 32,000." And if that's not enough for you, then it's not enough, and it's best just to be honest about that up front. So yeah, maybe just do a little bit of research. Another thing I recommend there, you can check out websites like Glassdoor, and they often have some very good salary data for specific organizations or job types. Another tricky one, what do you think your references will say about you? So this is tricky because they're going to be calling your references. So you don't want to say that they're going to say that you're the most wonderful person in the world if that's not exactly what they're going to say. So it is helpful, though, to understand or have a fairly good idea of how you think your references will talk about you. Of course, you should know that when you're choosing them. So just one to maybe think about beforehand as well. What part of the job sounds most challenging to you and why? I already kind of talked about that one, a little bit like the weakness question. And then what is your dream job? So that one, a lot of people think, oh God, they want me to say that this is my dream job, and it's not. You don't have to do that. If you have a dream job in mind, you can say what it is. But again, it's more about making that connection. How does this position fit into those long-term goals? And so that's what they're going to want to hear about. Okay, so moving on to the other kind of tricky interview questions, or the inappropriate kind of interview questions. So hopefully you never face this, you never get these kinds of questions, and for the most part, most organizations know you can't ask these kinds of questions. So questions that are off limits are questions related to a person's race, their age, their religion, disability status, marital status. A common one, well, not common one, but the one that I've heard most often um, is I will hear that female job candidates will go in and they'll get asked if they're planning to have children in maybe the next year or two. Totally inappropriate question to ask. You don't have to answer it. So really, the issue is now if you get that kind of question, how do you respond to it? So maybe it's again something to think about beforehand, just in case this comes up. There are different approaches. You could, for one, just say, I'm aware that you can't really ask me that kind of a question. I'm not comfortable answering it, and you're within your rights to just leave it at that. You could take it more from the perspective of thinking about, okay, so if they're asking me this question, there's got to be some underlying thing that they're trying to get at. And so usually what it is, if you're asking the question about, do you plan to have children? It's basically their underlying concern is, does this person plan to leave in 6 months or a year? Are they going to take paternal leave or maternal leave in the next year or 6 months? And again, it's inappropriate. You can't ask that. It's not relevant. But if you feel comfortable saying that, I'm guessing that you're just kind of wondering if I'm going to be committed to this job and I'm going to stick around. And then you can move into talking about why you are going to be committed to this position, why you're still really excited to work there, and kind of leave it at that. And that's a great way to respond to it. So again, it's something to think about beforehand. How would you potentially respond to that kind of tricky interview question? But again, hopefully you never get asked that. Okay. So we're getting towards the end of the interview now, and the end of the presentation as well. So usually most interviews will wrap up with them turning it over to you, asking you if you have any questions for them. And so this is really important here. You should always go into every interview prepared to ask, I would say, at least a few questions. The key thing, though, there is that they should be thoughtful questions. And what I mean by thoughtful is they shouldn't be questions that you could answer yourself just by checking out their website, doing a more thorough reading of the job posting, or finding out on your own in some fairly easy way. So it's got to build on what you already know about the organization, build on what you already know about the position, maybe asking a more detailed question about the kind of work that you'll be doing or projects that you'll be working on, things that might not have been described in the job posting, that they might have not talked about in the interview. So getting into a deeper understanding of what this position will look like. Questions about company culture, those are good kinds of questions to ask. What's the environment like? You can turn it over to the interviewers and ask them, what they like about that organization, what they like about working there, that kind of thing. All those are good sorts of questions to ask. I would just encourage you to avoid asking questions related to salary or benefits. Those are better saved for when they actually make you a job offer. So if they call you back and make you a job offer, that's the time when you start talking about salary and benefits. But I would leave it to that point if they don't bring it up themselves. Okay, so yeah, that's all I want to say there. I think I've had people come into interviews with 8 questions written down on a notepad, and they had their pen and they were making notes there as we were responding to the questions that they'd asked. And some people worry that that's annoying. It's not. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is a two-way conversation. You're trying to find out if this is a good fit for you as much as they're trying to find out the opposite. So yeah, take your list of questions, make notes. It shows a deeper level of engagement, and that's going to be really important. It shows that enthusiasm or passion, which is going to be crucial for you to show really throughout that whole interview. So that's an important part of it. Okay, so I mentioned I was going to talk specifically about virtual interviewing. So everything I've already talked about more or less applies to virtual interviewing, just the same. But there's a few other things that you might want to keep in mind when you have a virtual interview. First thing is just test your technology. So if it's Zoom and you've never used Zoom before, make sure it's downloaded. Make sure you've got your account set up. Go in there, test it out, make sure it's working. Same for any platform. Make sure your internet connection is strong. You just don't want to run into any issues there. I don't know if I have this one written down, but when you do run into technology issues, it's also helpful to have a backup plan essentially handy. And so your backup plan is essentially your phone. So just make sure that they have your phone number. And sometimes it's happens where somebody's connection just drops or it's just not good enough. And so it just moves to a phone interview, or maybe it's you move to a FaceTime or something like that. So just be prepared for that backup. Next point, just obviously find a quiet space. You don't want a lot of interruptions and noise in the background. So wherever you got to go to be in a quiet space, make sure that you're doing that. Be background aware. So just what's behind you, make sure that it's essentially appropriate. Clean, boring like me is just fine. At the very least, you can do the background blur, and that works just as well. Use headphones with a microphone. It helps to cut out a lot of the audio issues that you might encounter, and echo and that sort of thing. So just have a good set of headphones with a microphone. It makes interviewing much, much easier for everybody involved. Again, I already mentioned it before, but even though it's a virtual interview, still want to dress professionally. Do that one better, even though it's that virtual. Make eye contact, so you don't necessarily have to look right directly at the camera. But just make sure that you're looking at the screen and you're not just looking down at, maybe you got your resume beside you, which is okay. But make sure that you're not reading off notes or anything like that. You want to make sure that you're looking up and engaging with them as best as you can. And there, like I mentioned, you can have, notes or your resume, cover letter sitting there for you to make a quick reference to. It's maybe one advantage actually of virtual interviewing, is that you can have those things very handy and, look down or glance down to jog your memory about something. So that can be helpful. And then lastly, just the signing off part of it. So at the end of in-person interviews, you're thanking them, you're shaking their hand. Can't do that virtual, but make sure, again, to thank them all for the opportunity to interview. And then once you wrap it up, make sure that you're totally closed out of everything before you go and react in some way. So what has happened sometimes is that people think it's all closed out and they're done. The camera's still on, the audio's still on, and they make a loud noise like, oh God, and they make a bad expression and then it cuts out. And so they're left with that last impression of you. So just make sure that everything is totally shut out or closed before you react essentially to the interview. Okay. Yeah, just kind of last little takeaways here for you. Again, preparation is the most important thing. So do that research about the position, the company, reread that job posting. Again, do that reflection, that inventory taking of your skills, your abilities, your personal qualities, experience, all that. Go back to your resume, cover letter, and then think about those common interview questions and how you would respond to each of those. Um, yeah, again, a couple other last little tips. Obviously, again, communicating your genuine enthusiasm and passion for this position, for this organization, is just so important. Sometimes you'll get a candidate who looks great on paper, but you bring them in and they just can't communicate that genuine enthusiasm for the position in the company. And they're not necessarily going to be the best hire. They might be a bad hire because of that lack of enthusiasm. So on paper, you might not be the most qualified candidate. But if you come in and really communicate that enthusiasm and genuine interest, you might be the person that they hire because that's what they're looking for, right? So make sure that you're always communicating that throughout the interview. In person or virtual, punctuality, of course, is important. In person, general rule for showing up beforehand is 10 to 15 minutes early. Virtual interviews, sometimes they'll give you a little bit of a clue beforehand. They might want you to sign on right at 12 o'clock if that's when the interview starts. If they don't do that, maybe try to sign on about 5 minutes early just to make sure you're there on time. Shaking hands in person, again, that's important. And then lastly, sending a thank you email. I'll always recommend that you do this. If it's a job that you genuinely want, send a thank you email I'd say even within the same day, to all the interviewers if you can, or at least if it was just the hiring manager, one person that you were communicating with, at least send it to them. Reiterate your interest and your enthusiasm, your excitement about the opportunity, and just thank them for that chance to bring you in. So sometimes, you obviously you got through the interview, you think you did well, but you don't get the job. It happens to everybody. Um, but it's still really important to have left that really strong impression. And even if you get that call and they say, "Sorry, we didn't choose you," it's really important to again thank them for that opportunity, for bringing you in for the interview, for the chance to get to know them, the organization a little bit better. It's really important to communicate that courteousness, to show that you're still interested, because you never know, you might have another opportunity to interview with them. Maybe another opportunity comes up and they have you in mind because maybe you were second on their list and like, we really want that person, but we just don't have a position for them right now. So they're going to remember the impression that you left with them. So keep that in mind. Part of that is that thank you email, and part of it is how you respond when you get that call, whether it's an acceptance or decline as far as whether they're going to hire you. Last little thing here, interview anxiety. I just like to mention that, everybody gets anxious for interviews. It's quite common. Some people worry that if they show that they're nervous in the interview, that's going to reflect badly on them. I've never judged somebody for being nervous in an interview. To me, it just shows that they care, and that they're just human being. Everybody gets nervous, so it's okay to show that you're nervous. People will even come into the interview and just say it up front. I'm really nervous about this and I'm anxious. So just making you aware that I might take my time with responses or whatever it might be. Totally okay to do that kind of thing. Um, other things that I recommend you do. You know, I know people maybe do like a little brief meditation before they go in for an interview, or they just know how to calm themselves. They'll take a breath, during the interview. If they're getting stumped on an interview question, they'll just ask the interviewers if they can have a little bit more time to think of an example. They'll just take a deep breath and calm themselves, and that's okay. So don't get too anxious about being anxious, essentially, is what I'm saying here. Okay, so that is it. I'll open up to questions, but I'm just going to jump over to the website real quick first here, just to show you where you can find a little bit more content. So this is students.usask.ca, so hopefully you're familiar with this web page. You'll just go over to the job section here, and then down to interviewing. And so you'll find our interview guide here. which speaks to everything that I talked about and gets into a little bit more detail yet. So if you want to get a bit more info, this is what I recommend you do, is just come and check out the guide here. There's a number of different behavioral based questions framed around different skill areas. So that can be helpful for you in understanding behavioral based questions. Down at the back here, you got your 10 essential interview questions, a couple more than I showed you in the presentation. Again, things that I recommend that you are prepared to answer for every single interview. And then here's some other potential interviews that, or other questions that you might ask them at the end of the interview. So questions like, let's see what's some good ones here. Tell me about your most successful recent hires and what qualities made them stand out. So that might be a nice one to learn a little bit more about what they're looking for. Who are the key staff that I will be working with, again, to get a little bit of a deeper understanding of maybe the department that you're moving into and the projects that you'll be working on. Another one, if they don't give it to you beforehand, what are the next steps in the interview process? Something you should want to know anyway. When can I expect to hear from you? That sort of thing. So anyway, yeah, come check out this interview guide because it'll give you a lot more helpful info. And with that, I'll wrap it up and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much, Brock. That was fantastic. As always, I'm going to stop the recording and then we are going to invite the questions. But big claps and thank yous to Brock.